Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Never Mind the Dam Busters. I'm joined as usual by my co-host James Jeffries, but we also have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Dan Ellin from the University of Lincoln and the International Bomber Command Centre. Hello, chaps.
Hello.
What a couple of weeks it's been. We're just absolutely gobsmacked by the reaction to the podcast so far, aren't we, James?
Oh, gosh, yes. Wonderful reactions. Thank you so much to everyone that said nice things and everything. Yeah. I mean, this has come about a little bit by accident, hasn't it? It was literally just a tweet that started all of this. And it's lovely to actually get it going. And the fact that we've had lovely feedback means so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been absolutely mind blown by how many downloads we've had. We're up to nearly 1,500 already, which is not bad in sort of just 10 days or so that we've been going. I thought we might get about 30 or 40 when we first started, but yeah, it's been absolutely brilliant. So we're totally thrilled, and thanks so much to everyone who's downloaded and listened. So this week then, what have you been up to, James?
Well, the big thing really has been I gave a talk at RAF Cosford on the Royal Air Force in the Second World War on television and film, which is part of my thesis, and I absolutely loved going. It was a fantastic place. Warm welcome by Megan and Rab, and wow, so much there to see and do. And I think the thing that I was absolutely most giddiest over was going over and looking at the restored Hampden they've got there, but also
I'd love to see that. Yeah,
and I got up close to a Bristol Blenheim. It was just, and I went and oh gosh, they've got the Hawker Hurricane and the earlier Spitfire and everything there, the Boltwood Divine. I felt like a 5-year-old again, just wandering around, just looking at these incredible aircraft. And the fact that I could go so close as well and look at them was just absolutely wonderful. It was brilliant, yeah.
I haven't been there for absolutely years, but I remember being absolutely overawed by the Vulcan that they had there. I love that. I've still got some photos of that somewhere. But another trip back is definitely on the cards, I think. So this week I've been finishing off Invisible Campaign. At long last, it's all done. Just need to get the maps and the diagrams and all that stuff done, and that is the end of my work on mine laying for the moment, but we'll see what happens next with that. Should be out later this year, but I've absolutely loved doing it. It's been a geek's paradise, it really has. It's a bit niche, granted, but I've just loved doing it so much. And because it's not really a subject that anyone's written about before at any great length, it's just been so exciting to delve into all the archival material and stuff, so I've absolutely loved it. Anyway, that's enough about us. So, James, do you want to introduce Dan and sort of outline what we'll be doing, what we'll be talking about this week?
Yeah, so I welcome Dr. Dan Ellin this week, who I've been on a couple of podcasts, I think, with now. Dan, wow, I mean, his PhD thesis, I was looking at the Erks, which is something that is a subject I'm very, very much interested in. We think of Bomber Command, we think immediately of the pilots, we think of those that were in the aircraft, but it took so much to get these aircraft in the air. It was the people on the ground, and it was also the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which was something that I think in Dan's piece he definitely talks about, and we've got Gremlins to talk about, so much to talk about this week. And it's lovely to have you here, Dan, to talk about all of these things with you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on. I'm privileged to be number 2 on this podcast. I'm really looking forward to your book, Jane. I really enjoyed your lecture yesterday. I caught part of it live and caught up with the rest of it this morning. So yeah, absolutely great to have me on here. Thank you very much. Just talking to Jane earlier on, who was saying that she'd been reading my PhD thesis. So my PhD thesis I did at the University of Warwick. I've just realised it's 9-10 years ago since I did that. So you guys actually might be more familiar with it than I am, because I've not picked it up for absolutely years. But yeah, as you said, for every one person who flew, depending on where we are in the war, there's 8, 9, 10 people on the ground in various roles, working away, and without any one of those people, the job wouldn't be getting done. So, and it's, people talk about the ground crew. So in my work, I sort of make the distinction between ground crew, who actually worked on the aircraft. So that's the engine fitters and riggers, and then the armourers and the people who all the trades, compass swingers and instrument repairers and the people who work, supplying the aircraft with oxygen, those sorts of things. So directly working on the aircraft. But then behind those people, I mean, those are the people that you see in the photographs, usually parachute packers as well, maybe. But then behind those, there's the vast majority of people on an RAF station, and we're looking at the size of a small town, large village. We're talking 2,000 people on an RAF station. Are all the other jobs, all the other roles, and they're the people that their stories don't get told. And it's clerks and it's drivers and people doing all sorts of weird and wonderful jobs. I mean, the people who work in the cookhouse, they had a really bloody awful job. They had to get up at 5 a.m. and slice hundreds of slices of bacon and put on massive, great big gallon drums of porridge to cook. And some of those people, if anyone else had been a little bit naughty and was put on jankers, given a sort of disciplinary a telling off, some of the jobs that they'd be sent to do would be to help in the cookhouse. So there's people whose everyday job it was for doing the washing up and peeling potatoes, who were then sent someone to work with them who was doing their job but as a punishment.
Yeah, that's grim, isn't it?
So yeah, and they're some of the lowest paid roles in the RAF, and unless you've got people who are frying the bacon and eggs, the aircrew don't get bacon and eggs for their operational meals. So, it was looking at telling those sorts of people's stories.
But why do you think that ground crew and ground personnel stories have not been told in the past? Is it because they were viewed as very unglamorous, or is it because people are just so focused on the aircrew and their particular stories?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, say for every one chap who flew, there were 8, 9, 10 people on the ground who were in other trades. The interviews that we've done in the archive, it's the other way around. I mean, I know to a certain extent, perhaps, that ground personnel were a little bit older than aircrew. But in the instances when we found somebody who was ground personnel to interview, people have gone and said, well, you don't really want my story. I didn't do anything. You want to talk to the aircrew. They were the heroic guys. They did the exciting stuff. It's a little bit different with WAAFs because they actually feel that perhaps they have a story to tell because what they were doing was that little bit more unusual to, from everyday life. So I think WAAFs are more likely to be willing to tell the stories. Certainly when you look at published memoirs, there's a lot more WAAF stories out there than there are ground personnel ones, or ground crew ones.
How many WAAFs would there have been on a typical bomber base?
Yeah, I mean, it really varied as the RAF expanded and WAAF dilution, as it was known, sort of increased. Rule of thumb, there's probably one for every single aircrew.
Right, yeah, that many, yeah.
200 or 300 perhaps on a station at any one time.
And are they sort of taking over roles that were traditionally seen as male roles, or are they doing sort of completely new jobs that were created especially for them?
A bit of both. Again, it's different times, and it's it's not PC, and it's rather sexist. But it was thought that one WAAF was about the equivalent of was about 2/3 of a male person doing the role, and certainly they were paid 2/3 of the male wage. In some trades, yes, there was actually one-to-one substitution. So with things like clerks and drivers, in other roles, they did create roles specifically for women that were sort of they broke up. Say an engine fitter's job, they would split that into smaller sections. So at the beginning of the war, there was no role as such as a spark plug engineer. But they created the role. They found they could very quickly train women to clean and check spark plugs, and it was one part of what would have been a male job. It would have been part of being an engine mechanic, but it ended up the guy on the flights would take the spark plugs out, and then the WAFs would clean them and check them, and then put the new ones in. So yeah, it's a little bit of both. What's really interesting is how the blokes whose roles were sort of replaced by women, how they sort of felt about it all. And some of them, I mean, the whole thing in my thesis is looking at class and gender, and to a certain extent, if you weren't a flyer and you were male, why aren't you doing the maximum that you could be doing? Why aren't you flying? And there's lots of instances of officers and people in other trades who really look down on people who are doing feminine roles or not pulling their weight, or I mean, sometimes it's you can't fly, you need to wear glasses, or whatever. But they were looked down on to a certain extent, I think.
Can you tell us about something that's mentioned in your thesis, and that is the concept of the chop girl? I'd not come across this before.
Oh yeah, so what you got to think is aircrew. Their average age is about the same as a university student, so they're finding out about life. The average age of the WAAF is not much different. So there were lots of relationships between the men and women on the stations. The chop girl is a sort of myth. It's a rumor, although they did actually exist. If a WAAF dated an airman who failed to come back, it's sort of thought of as bad luck. If she dates two airmen who subsequently failed to come back, then she's going to be looked as more of a sort of a jinx. Certainly, if someone had dated three air crew members who failed to return, this is where the idea of the chop girl comes in. So she's a jinx. If somebody in your crew starts going out with her, you're going to want to tell them to stop dating her, because she's going to bring bad luck on the crew. So it's just one of these other superstitions, like taking a scarf as a good luck charm, or peeing on the tail wheel before you get in the aircraft. You don't date a chop girl.
That's just awful, isn't it? Poor girls. It's just dreadful.
Yes. Yeah, no fault of their own, but then they get this reputation, and in the few cases where it happened on a squadron or on a station, usually they were posted away somewhere else and given another chance. But how I've never managed to find anyone to interview who would say that that happened to me, or I was that. And it doesn't happen in memoirs. It's another one of those things where so and so was a chop girl. But yeah, absolutely awful for them. I mean, it's bad enough if you get into a relationship with somebody who doesn't come back. To then be stigmatised in that way, it's must have been absolutely awful for them.
That's sort of indicative of what, as well, of the massive casualty rate, isn't it? Basically, that something like that could happen.
Yeah. I mean, it could happen. Did happen. I mean, you also get WAAFs who made a rule of not dating aircrew because of that very reason. They didn't want to go through the heartache, and indeed run the risk of becoming known as a chop girl. But the charms of the aircrew was quite hard to ignore sometimes. So you can say, I'm not going to date an aircrew, but if you fall in love, you fall in love, don't you?
Very true. Very true.
I mean, bringing it back slightly, one thing that was clear from your thesis was you talk about the Erks, you talk about the ground crew, but you clearly lay out that the Women's Auxiliary Air Force were important. What sort of things were they doing? Just for the basics of the people that are listening that might not be aware, what sort of things were they doing?
Well, a small number were trained up exactly the same as male roles, so you did get WAAF engine fitters and engine mechanics, but they weren't allowed to work on operational stations. They would work on training units. But the majority of the roles, they broke them down slightly into smaller sort of units. So you've got drivers, you've got clerks, you've got parachute packers. It's 1940s. It's the way they were thinking. They thought that women were much better than men at repetitive sedentary tasks. So anything that you're sitting down and you're doing repetitively, that's a great role for WAAFs. But in some cases, that also meant that the WAAFs were their attention to detail, that they were ideally suited to radio work. Both radio wireless operators and repairers, instrument repairers. But also when radar came in, their attention to detail was far superior than the males. So that's the one instance where women were better at these sorts of jobs than the men. But yeah, I mean the roles expanded. From only having a handful of jobs for the WAAF at the start of the war, there were literally hundreds by the end of the war, and all sorts of varied tasks as well.
Now, I must confess that I'm quite sort of biased, and I do have an interest in this subject matter. As you two both know, one of my great uncles was ground crew at RAF Melbourne 10 Squadron. And one of the things I wanted to ask was about the relationships between ground crew and their, in inverted commas, aircrew, and how that sort of played out. 'Cause I know that my uncle Leo was very, very close to the aircrew that he sort of supported and worked with, and they remained friends their entire lives. Was that a common thing, or was that sort of something that was quite unusual? How did that generally play out?
I mean, so the general story is that the aircraft belonged to the ground crew, and the aircrew only borrowed it. And the important thing to remember is that the ground crew were posted to a station. They were probably there for months, years. An aircrew, if they were lucky and they managed to complete a tour, you're looking at they're on a station for a matter of months. It's probably not really worth the aircrew and the ground crew becoming friends and getting to know each other until it looks like they're going to stand a chance of completing a tour of operations, because the ground crew don't really want to put themselves into that possibility of loss and heartbreak as well. So in some instances, yes, but what you tend to hear of these relationships between aircrew and ground crew when it's been a lucky crew and they've completed a tour of operations. So there was a chap called Eric Howell. He was a fitter on 44 Squadron at RAF Waddington. He's one of the few people who wrote a memoir, and if memory serves, it's called The OR's Story, so the other rank story. But there's also a lot of his material, I think, in the museum at Hendon. He was at Waddington for 2 years, and for the 2 years he was there, he had 10 different Lancasters that he worked on. And he had 10 Lancasters because 10 Lancasters didn't come back and were replaced. They really got to see what the chop rate was like, what the attrition rate was like. They knew what the odds were. And also, you've got to remember, these were the groups of people who were being recruited to become flight engineers. It wasn't enough that you were working on the flights as an engine mechanic or whatever. Every now and then there'd be a call out saying, come on chaps, you can do a bit more. Why don't you volunteer to be the flight engineer? And some of them did, and they did, knowing what the odds were and what the likelihood of them coming back was going to be like. Eric Howell talks about one of his mates who lost 3 aircraft in very, very quick succession. And it almost broke him, because you would wave the crew off, they would take off in the aircraft, and then you wouldn't know anything. They'd just not come back. And they would if they were on duty that night, they would sort of camp down in the tent or the hut on dispersals and wait for their aircraft to come back. And if it didn't, they might never know why. Was it flak? Was it fighters? Did it run out of fuel? Was it a fault in one of the engines or something? Was it a fault of theirs? Perhaps did they not tighten up the head gasket enough? Was it them not getting that magneto to work correctly? Was that the fault? Was that why their aircraft didn't come back? So yeah, it could be quite emotional for the ground crew as well.
And of course, they'd have no way of knowing whether they'd been shot down or whether they were a prisoner or whether they'd been killed, and there was just no way of knowing, was there?
No, I mean, I suppose the rumor might get around what happened to a particular aircraft, but the people who it was important to tell will be the next of kin of the aircrew rather than the ground personnel. For them, eventually a new aircraft would be delivered to their dispersal, and on they go, start all over again with a new aircraft, new crew. And they were working out in the open on the ground crew. They're working out in the open all hours, totally open to the elements. They're not getting the food and drink as regularly as the people who are closer to the centre of the RAF station. There was a chap at 103 Squadron was working supplying the aircraft with oxygen, and he'd put the oxygen bottles on one aircraft and he'd gone back to the hangar. And you know what it's like when you go, have I left the gas on or have I forgotten to lock my front door? He just thought, hang on, did I actually connect up that bottle? So he hopped on his bike and he cycled back to check. But it's a 5-mile round trip that he went on, just to be sure that he could say that he'd done his job properly.
I think it's going to be weighing on minds, isn't it? Did I do this thing right? Did I connect this thing correctly? Did I, And I think, but as well, when it comes to ground crew, we think of the sense of, may I be morbid, dying in the air is a lonely experience. I mean, you could have an aircraft landing and you've got the remains of someone in a rear turret. Well, that's up to the ground crew to clear that up, to move the remains on and such like. That's going to be absolutely... I can't imagine approaching that and dealing with that. That's going to be traumatic, isn't it? I mean...
I mean, it is. I mean, one of my sort of favourite characters when I was doing this research is the medical officer called David Stafford Clark, and he also wrote poetry, and there's a poem of his that I think was published 43, and he talks about lifting the dead body of a gunner out of an aircraft, and he uses a metaphor that it's that cold at altitude that this chap's blood has come out, soaked into his uniform, and then sort of freeze dried, and he's saying it's like dusting off red chalk. So it's not. The cliche is hosing people out of turrets, but the ground personnel had to do that. The medical crews and the fire crews had to deal with all sorts of accidents there. I think it's in the Imperial War Museum. There was a WAAF whose job was working repairing wirelesses, and sort of trigger warning, folks. This isn't very pleasant, but she took a panel off a wireless that had been fetched out of an aircraft because it wasn't working properly, and it got bits of a wireless operator's skull inside it.
Oh, God.
So not very nice at all. Ground crew, they had their own risks, their own dangers. I've forgotten the number of people, but there were lots of horrific accidents with people stepping the wrong way into rotating propellers. I think there's at least one person who was crushed to death because they were starting a truck on a starting handle and it was in gear and it crushed him against a wall or something.
Lots of explosions too.
Lots of explosions. They're working from height. There's a guy that had a toolbox fall off an engine trestle and bash him on the head. But explosions. RAF Waterbeach, Jeffrey Dean, one of the medical officers there, it's near Christmas. I can't remember if it was 43 or 44. But there was an explosion. Something went wrong with one of the bombs or one of the aircraft, and the next 2 or 3 aircraft, their bomb loads also sort of sympathetically went up. And again, trigger warning. Jeffrey Dean talks in the ORBs and his recollections about how many people were killed and how many people were missing, and how him and his medical staff and other ground personnel basically had to walk the site picking up bits of people and putting them in a blanket because, the rest, most of them were just pink mist. So
that's just horrific, isn't it?
Really think about, when it comes to Boeing, what we think about the aircraft shot down, we think about the people on the ground, but we think about the accidents that happened with the ground crew and such like. And one of the things when I was researching the early part of the war was a lot of the ground crew would be gunners. The LACs would jump into the aircraft. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Dan?
Well, that by the sort of middle of the war, that didn't happen so much. But no one would fly an aircraft unless they had signed that the work was okay. So then the Form 700, it was called, that the ground crew and the pilot used to have to sign to say that the work had been done to their satisfaction. But that often meant that if you think it's okay, you can come on the flight with us while we test fly it. And what do you do if you just worked on it? You have to go, yeah, I'm confident, and up you go. But they're probably not issued with a parachute, so if it does go wrong, I can't remember when they stopped taking ground crew as air gunners, but as the war progressed, that was generally phased out. But there are some losses in the IBCC losses database of LACs and AC2s and things who have been lost as air gunners. I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense because there's a lot of training you need to know to have a hope in hell of shooting anything down. So
that was something I found incredibly surprising. I was looking and it had, like you say, LAC and such like, and they jumped on, and it wasn't a trained position at the start of the war. It was very much developed, wasn't it? The sense of an air gunner and such like.
But you look at the notes that that air gunners made when they were doing the training, and deflection shooting and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's really complicated. So it's a good thing they stopped that.
Well, I'm interested, if I can jump in with a quick question here, is this is something I talked about in my talk, not to selfishly plug here. I was talking about class, I was talking about representation, and certainly when we look at the allure of the flyer, the fighter pilot is the peak of that, etc. And then you'd probably have the bomber pilot and such like. But I wondered, and the representation in popular culture has definitely adhered to that. But I wondered what your thoughts were with the representation of ground crew in popular culture, especially in film and television and such like.
They tend to be comic relief in both propaganda and books and film and TV, and in the case of your favourite film, the Battle of Britain, it's a little bit of gendered sex interest, isn't it? Let's have some. Yes. The wartime sort of propaganda in the books that came out at the time, yes, they're sort of figures of fun. So the Joe Soap who carries the can for it's their fault if anything goes wrong, and sort of little spotty Erks of round faces and round glasses are sort of goon show kind of characters. Some of them are portrayed as, or but then there's also there's this sort of competent masculinity, and how the fighter pilots had the top button undone. To some extent, some of the drawings of ground personnel, that the scruffier and more oil covered they are, obviously the better they are at the job, and there's a little bit of that about there as well. But as far as class goes, there's a book, I think it was published in 1942, where somebody's talking about airmen sort of darting around and looking after the aircraft like they were thoroughbred racehorses, and there's definitely a bit of class going on there, and they are portrayed as sort of working class, kind of salt of the earth kind of characters.
It's funny you should say that. That's exactly what my great uncle was like. He was small, he was loud, he was the life and soul of the party. His nickname was Titch. Everyone on the base knew him. If you go into the 10 Squadron, sort of little museum thing that they've got there at Melbourne, he is in nearly every photograph. He was always the centre of absolutely everything. And it's almost become like a caricature, if you like, but that's what he was really like. He was just the life and soul of every party that they ever attended. So it's quite sort of interesting to hear that presented in that particular way. I'll put some photographs on our social media as well of him and these other mates from the ground crew too, so you can have a look at those. He was fantastic.
But I mean, they were really competent people, and they worked really well together in a team, and they liked to be left alone by the officers. Just bloody leave us alone. We'll get on with it. Doesn't really matter, what shifts patterns we're meant to be on. If it takes us an extra couple of hours or all night to fix the job, we will do the job as best as we can. So, and it got harder and harder as well as the war progressed. So Eric Howell mentioned before, when he started, there would be 6 to 8 people working on each aircraft out on the flights. With the expansion of the squadrons and Bomber Command, that number gradually diminished until he was working as a team with 2 other chaps. So there'd be 2 fitters and 1 rigger on each aircraft. And I think by 44, he was the only engine mechanic that was working on 2 aircraft. So every day it would be his job to do the daily inspections on 8 Merlin engines on 2 Lancasters. Because there was no one else,
workload,
to do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy.
It's the same. It's the same for the other trades as well. So the armourers, they would work in a team. They would fuse the bombs and then take them out and visit each aircraft in turn and load them all up. And it could be soul destroying, back-breaking work as well, because sometimes the winches didn't work, so you had to winch them up by hand. And then someone at High Wycombe would change the target, and you'd have to change the load. You all see the photos of the WAAFs driving the tractor with a load of bombs trolling along on the trolley behind. It didn't often work like that, so they would be at the fusing sheds, and they would fuse all the cookies and then take and deliver each of the cookies to each aircraft, and then they go back for the 1,000-pounders or the 500-pounders, and then they go back for the incendiaries. So rather than visiting one aircraft with 1 bomb load, they would tend to go around and deliver all the cookies and then go around and deliver all the other bombs and things.
I think a lot of the problems we have with the photographs is that so many of them were actually staged, weren't they? And they gave sort of quite a false impression.
Well, I'm quite interested, actually, because you mentioned the trades there. And when it comes to the aircrew, people that were in specific roles obviously had talents. If you had good eyesight, you'd be an air gunner, or if you're good at maths, you were a navigator or whatever. I just wondered with trades, the selection process and such, like, what happened there? Were there things that were particularly looked for? Did people, could they say, I want to be this and become it, or what were the skills and such like?
Yeah, I memean, the RAF tried to put the right person in the right job, and they would try to avoid the square pegs in the round holes, and you get people who would. A lot of WAAFs volunteered for the WAAF because they knew that the law had changed and they would be conscripted, and they think being in the WAAF is better than working in the factory, and I'd prefer that uniform to the army or the navy or whatever. They would put down what they hoped they wanted to do. But if your work history showed that you've been working in an office and you had all these skills, they're going to make you be a clerk. They're not going to train you up to be a driver. So, the RAF tried to do the best they could, but there were aptitude tests, and they did sort of do some sort of psychological profiling to try and find the right jobs for the right people. WAAF instrument fitters, they had more delicate, nimble fingers for getting behind instrument panels and fiddling around with the little screws and things. The other thing that's really quite interesting is whatever the trade was, the people took an immense pride in doing the job as to the best of their ability, and they always thought that they saw the importance of their one particular role, and the sought after ones, the most sought after glamorous positions were the ones that were closely associated either with the aircrew or with the aircraft. And everybody who had whatever their role was lived for those moments when they could make themselves most useful. So I mean, I know you said yesterday you were talking about Pip Beck and her experiences and how great her bookkeeping watch is. I can't remember if it's her or another WAAF. They'd be working shifts, and she would rather work an extra long shift so she could, she would be there for the takeoff of an operation and also see it through to the end, so she could see the chaps landing again, rather than your shift's over, go back to your billets and go to sleep. She wanted to see the job through, and lots of people were like that as well. And sometimes the officers didn't really understand, so there'd be people who go to bed at 6 a.m. after putting in an all-night shift, and then some evil sod of an officer would kick him out from an inspection at 8 o'clock in the morning. So,
Dan, can you tell us a little bit more about your current work and your research on gremlins? First of all, what are gremlins and why are they so important to the RAF?
Well, I'm not sure they're important to the RAF. They're important to me, and I think they're important to aircrew and ground crew. So, yeah, I mean, I've been working on gremlins since before lockdown, and I really need to get the article finished. Gremlins are the mythological creatures who were responsible for any intermittent or unexplainable fault, electrical, hydraulical, mechanical, psychological. Any fault that happened in an aircraft that couldn't be replicated on the ground was seen to be the fault of gremlins. And they're sort of like little elfy, pixie kind of characters. I mean, we know them from the film Gremlins and Nightmare at 20,000 feet and those sorts of things. Yeah. And we still have gremlins today in internet connections and in your computers. So any sort of any fault that you can't really explain, it's been done by gremlins. And yeah, they're really interesting. I think they sort of evolved from pixies or brownies or sprites or the sort of mythological creatures that you might have in a farmhouse kitchen that would sour the milk unless you placated them with, feeding them honey or whatever. But pretty much, I think as soon as we started flying, there were gremlins. It's been really quite fun trying to trace back the earliest instance of them. So there are rumours that they were around by the end of the First World War and the 1920s. And the story goes that somebody in India was drinking Fremlin's Ale, which was a brand of beer that they had out there in the 20s, and exclaimed, "There is a gremlin in my Fremlins." But again, this is just anecdotal. The first instance I think I found in print was there's one in the Aeroplane magazine, I think from the 20s, but that's just the word. It's a slightly different use of the word gremlin. But it's really fascinating because they've sort of evolved as aircraft evolved. So the first ones would run about on the wings of the aircraft, and they would have a bit like Edward Scissorhands. They would have snippers for at the end of their arms, and they would cut either the tension wires on your wings or the control cables, and lead you into fog and crash you into mountains and things like that. Whereas the later ones, and being the RAF, they were sort of named after different marks. So that the Mark 7 might be one that was really interested in messing around with your wireless set. But yeah, the later ones, they would drill holes in your petrol tank, or jam up your machine guns, or mess around with your compass, or empty all your hydraulic fluid. As aircraft got more and more technical, the gremlins got more and more technical as well. I've been sort of tracing them throughout the history, and they took off. They really, really went viral in 1943, because in 1942, Roald Dahl, he was a fighter pilot on Malta. He was then taken off ops, and he was sent to America as a sort of RAF attaché, and he started writing a kid's book. It's probably his first kid's book on gremlins. And the Air Ministry thought this was quite a good thing, because they'd already been using gremlins as in some of their training magazines, so things like TM and things like that. They thought it'd be a good idea to use it as propaganda, and it was picked up by Walt Disney, and Walt Disney was going to make a film about gremlins, and they sort of spread from there, a bit like a meme. So Dawkinsian meme, the old sense of the word meme, not digital, but the idea spread. So he started spreading this idea of gremlins through the media to publicise the film. The film was never made because Walt Disney had been bitten before by copyright issues, and he wanted to be convinced that Dahl had made had owned the copyright to Gremlins. Dahl always said he did, but it's blatantly obvious that he didn't. The film was never made. They did make it to the screen. Yeah, they did make it to the screen in a couple of cartoons, and Dahl's book was published. But yeah, the film was never made. But the idea of Gremlins spread into the general population and out of the RAF into the other armed forces, and they went around the world. So I think there was a howitzer on Iwo Jima that was named the Gremlin, and aircraft were called Gremlins, and aircrew drew pictures of them, and they're in training magazines. And Superman fought the Gremlins in New York in the newspapers. They were used to sell Lifesaver mints, which is the American version of Polo mints, I think. Headache tablets, and they sort of also, became part of the war effort. If you weren't pulling your weight in a factory, you were helping the Gremlins, and you were, helping the enemy. And I'm really interested in why and how aircrew were sort of interested in them. And I think it's sort of, it goes along with this sort of idea of superstitions, and it's kind of giving the aircrew an outlet for sort of some sort of creativity. So there's some wonderful drawings of Gremlins done by different aircrew chaps, and they pop up in poems and things. But there's also this sort of idea of the fatalism and black humour. They weren't really in control of their life, but if they could blame it on a gremlin, it made more sense to them than I don't know, blaming it on bad luck or misfortune or flak or fighters or whatever.
Absolutely fascinating. Talk about that all night. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's a similar thing with scarecrows as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that as well?
Well, yeah, scarecrows are another myth. When aircrew flying at night saw usually a Pathfinder aircraft that had either been hit by a night fighter or by flak and that exploded in midair, the aircrew were persuaded that they weren't actually seeing a Lancaster or a Halifax exploding. They were seeing this new Luftwaffe weapon. It was a psychological weapon, a scarecrow that was effectively meant to just put them off. And they were thought either to be shells fired from the ground or rockets fired from the ground that simulated an aircraft exploding. And some of the aircrew bought into this, and some believed it, and some believed it right up until the 1980s. And I think a couple of people we've interviewed for the archive still believed it now. But later on, it became clear that the Germans didn't have any such thing, and what they were seeing was actually aircraft exploding, and 7 chaps going like that in an instant. What's really interesting about them is, sorry.
Is that the same as Christmas trees? Because I've seen reference to Christmas trees as well in a similar sort of context. Or was that something different?
Christmas trees were what the Germans called the marker flares.
Right.
So when Pathfinders went over, they would drop marker flares. There were various different colours, red or green, and they would hang in the sky, looking like an upside-down Christmas tree. And
I see, right.
Christmas tree. But yeah, when a Pathfinder aircraft was hit and the bomb load exploded, crews did say that they saw part of the scarecrow might be the coloured lights, the marker flares from a Pathfinder aircraft. Yeah, it's again the bit of research I'm really interested in is actually nailing and pinning down when scarecrows started to be mentioned, because the story is it was the crew started talking about it amongst themselves, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that this came down from the Air Ministry or Ministry of Information or whatever, that when people say they've seen an aircraft explode, we'll tell them it's this, chaps, because it's a bit easier on them. So yeah, a lot more research to be done on that.
That's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Just all of these topics are just whole episodes just by themselves, aren't they, really? This is why we started the podcast, because there's just so much to talk about, so many different issues that just sort of tend to get glossed over or just touched upon or whatever. But it's great to be able to really sort of explore them all in depth. Well, thanks so much, Dan. That's been absolutely brilliant. We'll definitely have you back on to talk about loads of other stuff as well. So, James, what have we got coming up in our next episode?
Am I allowed to say, actually? I thought it was top secret.
It is top secret, but you can sort of give a hint of what the general theme is.
It involves a Halifax. Am I allowed to say that?
Of course. Yes, you're allowed to say that, yeah.
With a special guest. And that is all I think I can say, isn't it?
I think that probably is all you can say. Yes, next time we'll be talking about my great love, the Handley Page Halifax, in great detail, but with a twist. That's all we can say for the moment, isn't it? I think so. That's probably it.
Pretty much.
Okay, right. Well, that's just about it from us for now. So thanks to Dan for coming on today to talk about Gremlins and Erks and ground crews and ground personnel. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who's supported the podcast so far, and also to lots of other fellow podcasters who've also promoted the pod as well. I particularly wanted to mention Island Fortress, The Lowlander, Aviation Extended, Fighting on Film, and of course all the members of the We Have Ways independent company. Yeah. So that's just about it for this week. We'll see you again in a fortnight's time with our very special Halifax episode. So thanks very much for listening. We'll see you all again soon.